Hello, my name is Maj Milton-Amulo, and I'm here to talk about my math paper called On a Fair Multiflow Problem. And this is a modification of the presentation I gave to a bunch of math professors, so things have been re-edited to add a bit more context because I don't have the time constraints. So let's start with introducing networks. And if you're thinking of a network, you're probably thinking of something like this, or some social network, something with all these different connections and wires and such, or maybe roads, or all these things. And we'd like to have a nice mathematical picture of what a network should be. So what do we want? Well, we want to show direct and indirect connections. It's important to be able to say that you can get from one place to another without going through somewhere else. And it's also important to describe going from one place to another through somewhere else. We'd also like to show the strength of a connection. Not all roads are equal. You can have a 10-lane highway or a 2-lane little twisty-turny back street. Some of them can carry more stuff on them than others. And that's the way you should think about the strength or capacity of a connection, is how much stuff it can carry over time. And we also want to have directionality. There's stuff like one-way roads, but there's also stuff like when one side of a road gets filled, the other side isn't necessarily full. I'm sure if you drive or have been driven places, you've had the unfortunate thing of looking over at the other side of the highway and seeing everyone zooming by. We want to have the ability to not just say that this road has this much capacity, but how much the capacity is being used in each direction. There are some networks where there just straight isn't directionality. For instance, on sidewalks, if there's a bunch of people going one way and you're going the other way, you're gonna run into those people. But for a lot of networks, you can separate out the sides that are going one way versus going the other. What we don't want, though, is to be overly tied to one kind of real-world network. It would be nice if we could do roadway networks, internet networks, if we could get all of those different details into one framework. And here's what it is. So this might look a little strange. We have a bunch of these little circles. They're connected by these arrows, and then there are these numbers. So let's break through this. Each one of these circles is called a node. And a node you can think of as a point where you can go from one path to another. So if I'm at this node, I can go here, or I could go here, because these arcs, as what they're called, because they're pointing in a direction. And how much can go from this node to this node? Well, one thing can, or one unit. Units are arbitrary because we're mathematicians, not engineers. So just say that this one means that one thing can go, and well, this 3 means 3 things can go. And they go from here to here. They don't go there. They don't go back. If we wanted to show that there was a way to go back, we'd need another arrow pointing in the other direction. So these numbers here are the capacity. They're how big the arc is. Some networks with integer capacities, you can just say all of them are 1 and then I just draw multiple arrows. But it's usually a lot easier to see with just a number next to them. And you can see that I can get from here to here, but I have to go through multiple arcs. So I have to go like or any number of other paths. So you should be thinking about this sort of thing as networks as ways you can travel. Now I am omitting some details, like for instance, the way I actually drew this network isn't important. What's important is the connections and how strong the connections are. Usually though, it's a lot easier to, if you keep drawing the network the same way, for someone to be able to tell what it is. But now we get to the idea of flows, and flows are things on a network. As this lovely stock photo is, you think of flow as sort of an amorphous moving state, and the like. But really you should think about flows more in terms of this: the movement of people or items or data across a roadway network, or any sort of network that makes sense to them. Things go from here to here through a flow. And there are multiple kinds of flows you could have. Linear flows, you could have things where it's just one node to another, to another, to another. Or you can have ones that branch out and recombine. Often useful to not really think about them as distinct items, but like trends. That's also why they use flows, because of stuff like water flows. And you can also have flows that look a little different, like the flows of boxes in this stock photo warehouse. They move, and in general, you can split them up arbitrarily. So now let's go ahead, move on from just talking about flows in the abstract, and start looking at them. So here's our network from before, and we consider this one our starting point, and this one our ending point. So here's a flow. We use green for the source, also called the start. There's some other terminology, but source is the most commonly used one. And then it flows to the blue, the sink, the terminus, the end. I don't tend to use the word terminus, but it's here because T is different from S, so I'll often label this S of something and this T of something. And we have as the load of the flow, or the content. So in this situation, one unit of flow is moving across this arc, and it joins with this unit of flow. So we've got one, and then we have two that go across there. Note that despite this one having 1, this blue number in a box, which is how I'm going to show flows, shows that nothing's flowing across that one. And as we see, 2 comes in here. It could support 3, but only 2 come in. And you can think about this as sort of a bunch of paths. So you could say this path carries 1, and then there's this path which carries 1, and then there's this path which carries 1. But they all add together in this way. So there's a few conditions we have. And one of the first ones we should think about is what I call the capacity constraint. And why would we want this kind of constraint? Well, imagine if I wrote a 5 here, and then I added, so this was a 6 and this was a 6. That's according to another rule we'll get to in a bit. If I gave this to someone, they'd be like, there's a problem. This can't support 5. This can only support 1. It's like, it would be like overloading a bridge with too many heavy trucks. The bridge is gonna collapse. So we obviously don't want to do anything that's nonsense like that. But what's the other one? Why did I increase these ones as well? Well, it's to satisfy the second one, the conservation constraint. Now, this is a weird looking math expression, but let's break it down. First, this is the flow on an arc. So if I pass it this arc, the function would give me 1. If I pass it this arc, the function would give me 0. This one, 2, and so on. We can think of this flow function, or the flow's load function. We'll get to why I'm using load later. But we could think about this as being a way of asking, hey, how much flows on this? We're often used to learning about functions when they have explicit forms, like let's say g of x equals x squared minus 3. As you can see, this is why I don't handwrite everything. But really all you need for a function is to have it be well defined. If I give you something, what do you get out? So this can be sort of like a lookup table. So if I say f of friend equals fav number. So if I give you a friend, you put them in this function and they get out your favorite number. Now, I'm using friend because that's presumably you know the favorite numbers of your friends, and if you don't, you should maybe ask. But this is a well-defined function for you. I might have a different version of this function because I know different people than you, but the point is, This is a completely reasonable function. So we can consider that this little f of a is a reasonable function. We give it an arc, it tells us how much flows across it. Now, what about these? Well, a minus of n is all the arcs that go into it. So if I say this is my node, this is n, then these ones are in a minus, and then these ones are in the a plus. So what it's saying is, look at all of the arcs in a minus of this node, and all of the arcs in a plus of this node, and make sure they're the same. And as you can see, we get one from here, and then we give away 2 from here, and give away 0 from here. And this is true for all the nodes in this. So I could do this as n, this as n, this as n. All of those work except for 2. The source and the sink. And we should think about why that makes sense. Well, it makes sense because if this was true for the source, nothing could leave it. And if that was true for the sink, nothing could enter it. I didn't write that here, but that's something you should keep in mind. We always exclude those from the rule. And we can say, to simplify, that the first side's the incoming flow, and the other one's the outgoing flow. Not all flows are the same. And we can talk about the idea of the value of flow and how much stuff it carries. We can also consider it as how much stuff it carries over time, but that will become more important later. So amount goes in one end or out the other. Notice that flows are assumed to have no leaks. There's no flow that enters the source that doesn't leave the sink. So these two are the same. And let's go to the whiteboard. Let's begin with the most basic version. If I had 2 nodes, and this had value 1, it should be pretty clear what number I should put in this box. If I want to maximize the flow, that's pretty easy. Let's make this a little more complicated. What number do I put in here? Well, one thing goes into this node, so one thing should come out. Now, ask yourself, is this still a maximum flow? Well, this one isn't being filled up all the way, but notice it can't, because I would have to, in order to make more flow go across, this would have to be bigger than 1. But I can't. So that is the maximum flow. Great. What if I started doing, I don't know, something like added this. Let's say I wanted to keep this flow maximal. Well, if I put a little 1 here, and then a little 1 here, now 2 come in, and I can go ahead and I could say, put a little 2 there. So now the maximum flow is 2. Notice though that if I change these numbers, if I made them bigger, let's say this wasn't 1. Say this wasn't 1. Let's say that this was 5. It's still the maximum flow because I can't have any more come over here. So let's think about this. There's sort of this idea that you might be thinking about paths. So we can think about, okay, it seems like this number is really important. But why is it important? Does it have to be important? Let's add another arc. Let's say this one, I don't know, arbitrarily is 4. Well, we would like to put 4 here, but can we? Well, in order to have 4 there, we need to get 4 more flow, but we can't. This can go to 5, and well, that can be 4. There's something here. There's some combination of how everything's working that is useful, but maybe it's just not quite clear yet. But let's think back to the idea of flows being made up of lines, of paths through the network. So I have this path, I have this path, I have this path, and then I have this path. Then let's say my source is right here and my sink is right here. You might notice that I've never really drawn arcs going into the source or out of the sink, and that's because they're really not useful. But let's think about how we would want to construct a maximum flow for something like this. Well, let's think about this. How would you want to get there? Well, first you think, oh, they're right next to each other. Let's take the shortest path. You say, okay, I filled up the shortest path. Now what? There's already another path. Let's mark that with a little 1. That's the first thing you did. But now, there's a path that's length 2. And now you do that. Now notice with this path of length 2, it could be that this one's the one that restricts your flow, or it could be this one. And that determines what 3 paths you have. And let's think about those 3 paths. One of the things we're going to do is we're going to say, let's just ignore all of the arcs that we've already used up. So if we do that, we'll get something that looks kind of like, so these arcs are in all the versions because they haven't been used yet. Now and we aren't drawing this one because we've already used it up. And now there are 3 ways that this could go. So we could have the situation where both of these arcs are completely full. So that would lead to something like this. So the first case is that both of those arcs were full. The second case is that only that arc got full. And the third case is only this arc got full. Notice that all of them lost at least one arc. At least one of these arcs got completely full. So, in each of these cases, what's the next path? Well, we'd like to do a 1 path, but there's no 1 path. Let's see, can we go from 1 to 1? No, we've already used up the only path that does that in all of these. Can we do it in 3? Well, in this one, we can do it in 3. In this one, we can do it in 3. And in this one, we can do it in 3. But we can also do it in 3 with this on that one, and we can do it in 3 with this on that one. Now, let's think about this. If we notice that there's an absolute limit we can see to how much you could do. Notice that right here, if we fill up this arc right here, then it's clear we have no more paths. We couldn't possibly do it if nothing can leave the source. And over here, same for this one. And on this one, both of those are critical. Notice that no matter what combination of things you do, some of these are going to get filled up. We can think about and we're saying, Now, take a moment and think about this. We can fill up this path first, the one that goes around, or we can fill the one that goes across the diagonal first. Imagine that this arrow always went the other way. This arrow always went that way. Don't worry about it. It doesn't affect that step anyway, so just deal with me here. And we could think to ourselves, in order to have it so that no more can go on this arc, we need it to be that at least one of them on these 3 is filled up. And for this one, at least one of these 3 is filled up. Notice that if this one is filled up by the first thing, well, obviously we can't get any more flow by doing the second one. And likewise over here. And this one, obviously, is just filled up with that. So, what we're getting at of an algorithm, paths of length 1, then paths of length 2 if there are any, paths of length 3, so on and so forth, and eventually we have to have filled up enough. And it should be pretty clear why that this would create a maximum flow. But what is that maximum flow? So what I've described here is an algorithm for finding a maximum flow. I'll make the actual name of the algorithm appear on screen, but how big is the maximum flow? If you're given a concrete example, you can just use the algorithm. But what if you aren't? If you aren't given a concrete example, and you have some kind of network that looks like this, and you've got X, Y, Z, you can't really do the algorithm on this. And there is a way you can catch this in totally symbolic terms. There is a catch, though. And to understand that catch, we need to start thinking about something that I was sort of dancing around before. That there are choke points. That there are some kind of thing that if you have them, if that's full, nothing go across. Well, let's think about these choke points. Well, obviously, so that's obviously a choke point. So if that's full, nothing can go across. What other ones? Well, if these two are full, nothing can get through, because all the source can do is go to here. And if these two are full, then that's also a choke point. Now all these chokes are called cut sets. And a cut set is a set of arc which if you remove them from the network, you couldn't get from source to sink. Now there are other definitions, but stay with me. This is the one you need for this. And the one I showed here are all minimal. Cause let's use this cut set here as an example. If I only crossed out that one, flow could still get around. And likewise, if I only crossed off this one, flow could get around. So this one is minimal. There's no more than could do it. You can have non-minimal cut sets just fine, like that. That's a non-minimal cut set. They're not very useful because they just increase the number. And if you're thinking about it, you're thinking about, okay, well, if this is a cut set, and this is a cut set, and this is a cut set, and let's say we have that's A, that's B, that's C, that's D, then you can say, okay, well, it obviously, whatever this max flow value is, let's call it big F, it's got to be at most D, and it also has to be at most A plus C, and it also has to be at most A plus B. I feel like there's a way that makes this easier. O equals the minimum of D, A plus C, A plus B. Note that this network, we could have added a lot more arcs to it. We could have added more nodes. We could really mess that up, right? We could have huge networks. You could have network, doing all these crazy things. And in principle, you can find cut sets. You just look at your nodes and you decide which ones are needed to get from this little green dot over here to this little blue dot. This is not like a real network, but like it's just sort of showing an imaginary, hugely complicated network. There is a problem. In principle, all you're doing is taking the minimum of a bunch of things. In practice, though, huge. For a network like that, the set of even just the minimal cut sets, which are all you really need for this one because any non-minimal cut set is just going to be like, oh, also the minimum of A plus B plus C. And it's like, cool, but that's obviously going to be bigger than everything else. So you only need to take the minimum of all the minimal cut sets. Only problem is the set of minimal cut sets can be huge. And it gets huge really fast. In fact, let's go ahead and look at an example where the minimal cut set is very, very large. Alright, how are all the minimal cut sets? Well, you need to take one of these three, and one of these three, and one of these three. So you have 3 choices times 3 choices times 3 choices. You have 27 minimal cut sets. And that's for this example. If I just, drop one of these in, and maybe one of these, now the numbers of minimal cut sets is way bigger. Now, it's not 27. It's greater than 27. By probably a lot. So, you can see that this is a problem. This is not something you ever want to calculate. But it does have a few nice properties. And that is, symbolically, it's completely simple. If I had some network where my arcs weren't just numbers, they were variables, or I had x squared plus 2, x cubed minus 3, and this one was x to the negative 1, and I don't know, this is a completely not a thing that would happen. Let's throw in a little x times y there. In principle, you can do this. And let's say, a little bit of a spoiler for what's happening next, you wanted to know the value, the maximum flow. Well, if you wanted to know the maximum flow of this thing, it would be the minimums of all the cut sets, which are, this is a cut set, and this is a cut set, and this is a cut set. Let's just say that's all of them. There's probably more. You can figure it out. But now what you could do is you could add all those cut sets together and figure out the minimum of them. Remember this. This will be useful later. Alright, so now we've looked at how we get the value of a flow, and how we maximize that value in 2 different ways. We look at the theoretical way that's generically applicable, and then we look at the practical way, which requires more specific knowledge, but it's not too hard to do. But now we get to the idea of multiple flows on a network, and you can think about this as different items that need to go from place to place on a truck, different groups of people in a subway, factory that needs to move several different kinds of components to different things. One of the difficulties of this kind of problem is that all of the flows have to share the same capacity. So if one flow uses up capacity, the other flow can't. And also, one flow can block another flow because of this shared capacity. Now, there are some existing techniques, but there's a restriction on them. What that you can do is you can tell them, I want this flow to be this value, this flow to be this value, this flow to be this value. And it can tell you, yes, here's a thing that does that, or no, there isn't. And if it gives you no, it doesn't give you any information about how close you are. So it would be nice if we could get some more information. And one of the things that would be nice, most likely, is to expand flows. And let's think about this. The way that flows are now, we're restricted by how big the capacity is. We can't put more flow across an arc than the capacity. And this makes sense, but it can be a bit limiting. For instance, you can't just arbitrarily add flows together. You have to check if that breaks the capacity limit. And you can't scale a flow up and down. So if you have a flow of a certain value and it's too much, well, you can always move that down. But if you're doing it the other way, it might not be a flow anymore. The question might be, what is it? Well, what would be nice? What would be useful? We could always add and rescale flows. By rescale, we mean multiplying all the numbers, and we're only considering doing that by non-negative numbers. Really only positive, though multiplying by 0 is defined, it just makes it nothing. Obviously, we can't have negative flows because that doesn't make sense, because those are one-way roads. And there's always a way to return whatever these thingies are into real flows. And we can think about, well, if we scale things down, they fit, but we'll get to a reason why this is a separate bullet point in a bit. Here's the bit. We don't want any flow to go across a zero arc. And we'll see later why that's so important. Now let's just define these. Let's define these as unrestricted flows, or as I'll refer to them for short, U flows. Now let's define these things. So we want to keep the conservation constraint. And why is that? Well, the conservation constraint is that for everything except for the start and end, or the source and sink, we have the same amount of flow going into a node as out. And this makes sense because we don't want flow to magically appear or magically disappear or leak, as I called it. But we have a different kind of constraint instead of the capacity one. Instead, we have no flow on a zero arc. Otherwise, if the arc isn't zero, it can be any non-negative number. Now, why is that the case? Let's take a look at the whiteboard. So if I have a little simple network, and now this is before I've written any numbers down, you can already see that there could be paths like this, or like this, or like this. But imagine that this one has 0. Now let's think about this path again. How much flow could it carry? Well, it can carry at most the capacity of its arcs. But one of those arcs is 0. So that flow can't be anything beyond 0. In fact, it's almost like that arc wasn't there at all. Now, it is technically there. We'll see that there are some times where it is useful to consider, but it's very clear that we don't want this, because no matter how small these are, we can always scale our U flow down to make it, as long as they're not 0. So if this is 1 and this is 1, we could divide all these numbers by 4 and they'd all fit, except for this one. That's a problem. So we force this can't be 1, this has to be 0. And because of that, because of capacity constraint, that can't be 4, that has to be 3. So this should give you a good idea about why we have this rule about zeros. And you might be like, why would this even be here? Why is there even a 0? And the reason is, let's move over a bit and imagine this scenario again. I mean, first we can get rid of this one because it's not going to be useful for anything else. But imagine that, let's say we have one flow on this and one flow on this. And this one's a 1, this one's a 2. Well, we can think about, okay, what's left over? Well, there's going to be one unit left over here. We're going to erase this, but keep in mind that those are still real. We just, in this step of the process, we're not including them. There was a 1 here. So now this is a 0. We don't want to actually delete the arc. We deleted the arc before because we were dealing with a generic case, but right now we want to keep this arc. We don't want to consider paths like that because it has a 0 arc, and hence no flow can go across it. So we only want to consider right now paths like that. Now, these aren't the numbers of the original network. What we're doing here is we're talking about something called a residual. And the residual is what's left over after a flow. Let's say we're going to just omit all the zeros. So let's say this is our flow. It's 1 there, 1 there. We can think about, okay, all of the other blue numbers are zeros. We can talk about the residual, because if we make that other network, so now if I put another flow on this network right here, the residual after it, I can add this flow to it and it'll work on this one. So we subtracted flow, and now, but if we get a flow on this, we can add these flows, and this is actually part of the algorithm that I was describing earlier. I didn't really go into it much, but you can think about, there's this sort of concept of when we're removing space, we're using up space and we're making these residual networks to represent what space we have left to expand into. Now, this doesn't totally work right when you have U flows and other loads, but we'll get to how we adjust this concept. Now that we're back from the whiteboard, let's take a look at another concept, this one of utilization. There's a lot of great things about U flows, but there is something we lose, and that's the physicality of it. If we find a U flow that has a value that we want, but it's putting 100 liters a minute through a 1 liter per minute pipe, it's not really as useful to us as one that does the same thing but is closer to a flow. And utilization is how full a network is. We can express this symbolically as well, but I'll get to that at the end. So we can compute the utilization of a U flow, combinations thereof. Anything that is describing a load on a network is valid. And if it's less than or equal to 1, the flows or whatever fit inside the network. We aren't causing any sort of problems. And now let's just go ahead and quickly think about how we would define this. Well, we want it to be the maximum of something, right? Because of this last thing right here. If any of the loads are bigger than the capacity, it clearly shouldn't be less than or equal to 1. So we want it to be the maximum of something. And we want it to be over arcs, but we want it to be over arc such that the capacity function is not 0. The other name for the numbers are weights. So I use W. This is to avoid confusion with C being for cut sets, though you could imagine just having a C there and it's okay. So you want the weight of the arc to not be 0 because it's kind of ambiguous because there can't be any load on it. And we want to know, okay, let's see, let's set the load on the arc over the weight of that arc. And we think about this for a moment and we can realize that this is actually a really good definition, because if the load is always less than the weight, then this fraction will always be less than 1, or less than or equal to 1 if the load could be the weight. Let's say that this maximum is greater than 1. Let's say it's 2. Then imagine we divided the load by 2. So let's say load prime of A equals load of A over 2. Then, if the utilization of this load was 2, the utilization of load prime, all of these are half of what they used to be. So the maximum is half of what it used to be. So that's why utilization is so useful. It works with scaling in this way, and we can flip between problems of asking about maximum value given some ratio versus set values but trying to minimize utilization. Because if we can imagine, if the utilization is a half, we can double everything and still have it fit. So this is very useful. The other way to think about utilization is in terms of time. The reason why we can think about utilization in terms of time is that things don't carry just a set amount. They carry a set amount over time. A road can carry so many trailers per hour. A subway system carries this many people per minute. All these sorts of things. If a subway carries a person a minute, how many people can it carry in an hour? 60. This would be a really bad subway, but How many does it carry in 10 minutes? 10. So you can think about, utilization is how much time to have all these flows happen if all of your capacities are rates. Then the utilization tells you how much time it takes. So now we can think about a new problem. Well, what do we want for this new multi-flow problem? Well, we want to minimize utilization. We want to find the fastest answer, or the one that fits the best in the network. But this would be trivial if we didn't have a few more conditions. So let's think about those. We'd love a condition that makes sure that we're getting things in the right ratios. And one of the easiest ways to think about this is an RC car factory. We need a certain number of wheels, we need a certain number of bodies, we need a certain number of controller units. And we need 4 wheels, 1 controller unit, 1 body to make an RC car, right? Well, we surely don't want to have it be that gives us hundreds and hundreds of wheels per car body. All those extra wheels are going to waste. So let's think about, how would we do that? Given that whole time thing, and say, let's minimize the time to make 1 RC car. Well, we clearly also need the wheels to get from where they are. Okay, yeah, the value is fixed. We need 4 wheels, 1 body, and 1 remote control unit. And they must start and end at fixed points. You need the wheels here, you need the bodies here, you need the control units here. And they all come from different places. So how are we going to solve this? Well, we're going to back up a little bit and think about a detail that we sort of neglected. In particular, we can think about traffic. You are not the only people on the road. There are other people on this road. Now, you can do what this is saying and solving the problem I was looking at by saying, okay, all of my U flows, except for one of them, are becoming this obstruction. But this obstruction could be anything. It could be traffic. It could be other things you're carrying on these lines. They're all some arbitrary load A. And we typically will use a little O there to say this is the obstruction load rather than the load of the flows or something. So we want to minimize the utilization of the U flow. So let's say U of A plus load of 0, load obstruction of A. We say, okay, we want to minimize that. Note, however, that this is not the same as minimizing this utilization and this utilization. We can imagine that if we had 2 arcs, and the load did 1, and the flow did 1, let's say that these are both capacity 1, then the utilization of the whole thing is the minimum of them, not the sum. Now, in more complicated situations, there's a lot more there, but basically just know that utilization is, depending on where the loads are, is somewhere between the maximum of the utilization of those 2 things and the sum. So we want to minimize the utilization of this quantity. Now the thing is, we don't actually care what caused the obstruction. It could be traffic, it could be a temporary closure, it could be a whole bunch of things. We don't actually need to use any of that. So let's solve one of these obstructed network problems. The first we can do is we can say, well, we can't be any better than the obstruction itself, because flows are never negative, and if you add 2 things that are non-negative, it's the same or bigger. We can think about the space left over, the residual. There are quotes here because the residual might not be of the network unscaled. That's why we were talking about residual before. But it's still a leftover space. If the network isn't big enough to handle the load, we can rescale the network in a particular way to get So let's say an example. So right now we have these purple boxes that are showing some arbitrary load. This is in a flow, so I'm not using blue, and this is a network that we'll see again later. They say, well, if you took the residual right now, you'd start getting negatives. You'd get -5 here, -2 here. Clearly is not correct. But we can think about something related, which is, well, how much would we have to make these things bigger by to make it so we wouldn't get negatives? And it turns out the answer is multiplying everything by 4. Now, this does mean that the minimum utilization for whatever thingy we're doing here, whatever flow we put on here, is 4. But we'll get to that at the end. But just know that we want to do this so that the minimum is 0, not anything higher and not anything lower. So then we can take the difference and we're left with this residual with the yellow numbers. And this is what we're going to call the base network, N subscript B. And the base network is called that because if the utilization was the minimum possible, let's say that our goal flow, the goal of our flow was to get one thing, we wouldn't need anything more than the base network. And hence, the minimum utilization of the two together would just be 4. Right, we did this. We considered, well, if the base network is large enough that we can make a flow to hit the flow goal, we're done. It's at the minimum possible. If it's not big enough, the actual minimal utilization is not the same as the theoretical. So we should add more capacity somehow. Let's go to the whiteboard. Welcome back to the whiteboard. Think about the utilization. So UT of thingy network. Let's just call this load sigma. And that's a load function. So now what do we have? Well, so this is the maximum of load sigma A over WA. So we have this load, the weight, and this is of the original network. Now I'm going to do something a little strange, and I'm just going to put a little subscript S. Now you might be like, what are you doing that for? It's going to be useful to give that a different name than load B. Okay, now also let's go ahead and break up load sigma. Well, we have part of it's the flow, and we'll just call that F, plus the load of the obstruction. Notice that NB is equal to, well, with some kind of residual, so we're subtracting the obstruction from NS, our original network, or as we'll learn of it, calling it the scaling network. But we kind of need to multiply it by something. And that something is the utilization of the obstruction on the original network. We should pause for a moment to think about why this would make sense. So take a quick look at what the values of this are. Let's see, the utilization of load obstruction over times NS, well, that's the maximum of load obstruction of an arc over WS of an arc. And let's take a look at let's look at arc alpha. We can see that whatever this thingy is, it's definitely greater than or equal to load at alpha over WS at alpha times WS at alpha. We know that's the case because the A, we're doing the maximum over A. If alpha is 1 where this thing is maximal, then this is equal. Otherwise, it's greater than or equal to. And we can very clearly cancel these out. What we get is that this combination is at least the load function at alpha. And that's what we need. We need node B to be greater than or equal to 0 everywhere and as small as possible. But let's think about something else. Also, I'm going to give this thing a name real quick. I'm going to say that this is K. So what I want to argue is that This equals k plus x. Now this x seems weird. It's not a variable I mentioned before. Let's call it the scaling parameter. But I'm going to set x such that flow f, a flow on, I'm going to say that it's a flow on x, ns plus nb. Oh, and let's drop a little therefore here. We're thinking to ourselves, wait, why does this work? Well, remember the concept of the residual. If we subtract a flow from a network, the network we get out, we can put flows on. Or this doesn't have to be a flow, it could be a load, it could be something. And then if we add back the other thing, the thing that we remove to get the residual, we'd get something that works on it. So with that in mind, let's go over here and think about what this means. So since it's a flow on that, we can say, okay, f of a is less than or equal to xws of a plus wb of a. Now remember what nb is. This becomes k times ws of a minus L obstruction at a. And that's by this definition up here. So we move this over. Now let's just go ahead and add load obstruction of a to both sides. So what we get is f at a plus the load obstruction at a is less than or equal to x plus k ws of a. This is looking very good because it's looking like this claim I made. This claim I made completely out of the blue. But now we can start to see where it comes from. Now let's divide it, both sides, by ws. We know it's positive. We're ignoring cases where ws might have zeros in it. And we also realize, hey, wait a minute, this is load sigma at a. So we get load sigma at a over ws at a is less than or equal to x plus k. Now since this thing is always less than or equal to, there is actually a thing, there is a little caveat I have to put here. And no smaller x. If f is a flow of something with a smaller x, then this x isn't the same. The reason why we needed that is to make sure that this actually happens. But because that actually happens, we can take the maximum of it, of both sides, over all a. And well, the maximum of this is equal to, well, this is always constant for a. Because of the pink thing, this goes away and it becomes an equals. If that wasn't the case, then it would still be less than or equal to. But in the case where it is a flow on that thing and nothing smaller, then we have an answer. Now, why did we do this? Well, we know how to make max flows on a network. And in theory, we can compute max flows on a network. So if we just say, okay, if I find an x that works, then that tells me that I found something that has utilization k plus x. So making this x smaller means that our result is smaller. So that's great. All right, hope you're ready. Hope you got all that. Let's continue. Let's put this all together. We flip the load into adding two networks together, as we saw at the end of the last whiteboard. And we have the base network and the scaling network. In the scaling network, we give it an arbitrary scaling variable x. And we can use max flow min cut in theory on this. And we'd get a function that shows how the value it is. And we get, for each cut set, the minimum of all of these little lines. And there's actually a structure to this that's useful. We obviously are not going to compute the thing directly because the number of cut sets for any real network is very large and very inefficient, but we can take advantage of a few tricks. First, we should talk about something that has been discussed in other videos before, but the bisection method, which is that you start with 2 points and you say, I want to find what's here, and you say this is too low, this is too high. I go into the middle. This one's still too high. I go to the middle. This one's too high. I go here. Now this one's too low, so I go here, and I'd keep dividing over and over. And this is a very simple method and can be used with anything that's an increasing function, which this is. And if you're wondering why I'm so confident that this is an increasing function, well, you're making the network bigger when you make x bigger. There's no way you could make it so that the maximum flow gets smaller. But there is a problem. It might not ever find the answer. And there's an example of this that's actually surprisingly easy. So let's look at y equals x, and we start with 0 and 1 as our endpoints. And we want to know when y equals 1/3. Obviously x equals 1/3, but if we did it, we'd go, okay, we'll look at these. 1/2. 1/2's bigger than 1/3. Okay, let's try 1/4. 1/4 is bigger than 1/2. Okay, 1/2 plus 1/4 is 3/4 divided by 2. Let's go try 3/8. We're never going to get to 1/3 because 1/3 cannot be written this way. But we can do a little better. We've modified bisection. Now, I didn't totally discuss them last time, but these little gray lines, those are the theoretical lines of each cut set. And there's this yellow line, and that's the one where our low is. And we can actually figure out, in this case, the slope of this line to use it to help. So we can use it to tighten the bounds. So let's say we were looking for a... Well, I know that it can't be any earlier than here because that's the fastest it could be. Also, I'm very sorry that that line is not straight. So it clearly can't be anything earlier than there. And that's because this function's convex. If it was concave, this wouldn't work. The convexity, you can think about it as being, if I was considering building this function up and I found cut sets and I removed them, found cut set, remove, found, remove, it would be trimming corners every time or doing nothing. We can't get something that will go like that because this line is smaller than this line, so we can't get any concavities. We also only need to do max flow problems. And this seems weird at first, because the max flow problem basically is sampling the function at a point. You might wonder how we get this slope from a max flow problem. We'll get there. That is a point of discussion. And we're guaranteed to do it in finite time. The actual maximum amount of time it takes can be really long, but there's only finitely many cut sets, even if there's a lot of them. So we can't get into this situation where we're trying to take halves until we get to a third. So let's look at an example. In this case, we have an xns plus nb. And that way we can look at this all on one thing. Now you might recognize nb from something, and that was intentional. But as you can see, all of these capacities are based off of this x value. And I'll give you a little hint. X equals 5 for the thing we're looking for. We're looking for what's the smallest x so that the flow from the source to the sink has value 20. You can pause right now and compute what they are when x equals 5 and see that it works. But we don't know that. Let's just go ahead and try to calculate this. Well, first we want to look at, okay, what if x equals 0? Well, we only get a value of the flow of 1. And you might be like, what about all these other ones? Well, they're all feeding off of it. So we only look at the arcs that leave, and we get a 1 and a 0. That adds up to 1. So that's the best flow on NB. What if there was no obstruction? Well, on NS, then we get 1 and 2. The base flow is 1. The flow that we get from adding NS is, I'm saying at least, because, well, we'll see. So we know that, so this is how we're going to calculate our high point. The thing is, the reason why we can say this is we can always take this flow and add this flow times x and get a valid flow on the result. It might not be maximal flow, but it is a valid flow. What we say is that we're looking for something where the value function, this little v of h, it's useful to give it a little name like this, is at least 20. So we don't know what it is. Well, we can go ahead and we can say the high point, 1 plus 3 times the high point is 20, and we give this little xh a name, saying that that's our high x. That's our, on the bisection method, that's the one that's further away. So we know that whatever the answer is, it can't possibly be bigger than 19 over 3. Let's compute the low. So we have an interesting network here. And you might be like, what's up with these infinity symbols? And where did this come from? Well, let's start by looking at this. Notice that the capacities of all the arcs on this one that aren't infinity are here. Now, what's the thing with all the ones that are infinity? Let's compute the residual. So the residual here, well, that's 0. The residual here, that's 2. The residual here, that's 3. This one's 2. This one's 2. Notice that everything that has a residual that's not 0 gets an infinity. And that's because when you're adding a very small diff change in x, the amount left over is infinite, in giant air quotes. I go into this in a lot more detail in my paper, but you can think about this sort of process as being valid. And you might be like, well, how do we know that we're not getting something that's infinite? Well, if we got something that's infinite, that means we didn't do the maximum flow on NB. We didn't fill up the whole flow. So that seems reasonable. So we compute our maximum flow and we get 4. And this is the slope of it. Because if x is small, you could add x times this flow to the base flow and get something that works. However, if x is big enough, these aren't really infinity, so it wouldn't work. And it also must be the highest of everything, because as we get further along, more and more of these useful connections will be filled up in their base flow, so there will be fewer and fewer infinities. So if we use this, if we assume that it's just a line going from that point onwards, we're overestimating the value function. So when we flip it around, we're underestimating where it is. So we get VXL. And we know that the value at XL must be less than or equal to 1 plus the slope at that point, which is here is 0. So we get 19 over 4. And now we do bisection. So we take the simple mean, the arithmetic mean, and we get this. I'm very sorry that it comes out to these terrible fractions. The value, however, is 21 and 5/8. And the median thing is we're at 19 over 3 plus 19 over 4 all over 2. And you can figure out what that fraction is, but I don't really care right now. But I did this all correctly. So we know that, okay, it must be, whatever our goal is, it's between XL and X middle. Whatever answer is, it's between those two. Well, now we should look at X low. The flow at X low, so this is, X is 19 over 4. And we say, okay. And we get that it's 19 and a quarter. So we're close. let's compute the derivative. So again, what we do is we look at this, and this one doesn't get to be infinity because it filled up the whole thing. This one doesn't get to be infinity. This one doesn't get to be infinity. And this one doesn't get to be infinity. Now all the other ones, and those are all x slope. And hey look, we actually get something that looks pretty good. So let's see. I think that flow is 3. Yeah, value is 3. So now we can compute the low estimate. Well, it's 5 because 19 and a quarter plus 3 times 5 minus 4 and 3/4, which this is 19 over 4. Well, that's 20. So again, the same idea. We have this little minus the x we're starting at, and our high estimate is also 5. This comes out because we compute that 19 and a quarter to 21.5. The other thing is that the value, the slope, is already the lowest possible, so we know it's the same. So there we go. Some of the numbers are a little hairy, but we got there very quickly. But why did we do all this? We reduced the utilization from some whatever naive technique we had. Let's say we just took the flow on the scaling network and we just scaled it up till it was 20 and plopped it on top of those obstructions. Well, whatever it is, we found the best one. We found the lowest x, which in turn means the lowest utilization. But we didn't compromise the value of the flow. So that's nice. In fact, it sounds useful. Where is it useful to reduce the utilization but keep the flow value the same? Aha! Now we can update the U-flow with this flow we found. We were using flow because it was a flow on the network we were working with, but in the original thing, we don't know if it fit, so we call it a U-flow. And the obstruction is all the other U-flows we neglected. We started this whole thing by saying, just lump everything else together. Now we can unlump everything, and that doesn't change the utilization. And by replacing whatever flow that was there before with this one, well, it improved it. So now we can try another flow. Because the flow we updated changed, the environment, the surroundings of all the other U-flows are all different. So if one couldn't be optimized before, now it might be able to now. And this comes to AFPA. I have on screen what the acronym stands for. It's a lot, but we've already walked through a stage of AFPA. Now, we ignored where the other flows came in, and in that sort of network, it's kind of weird about asking what kind of flows would have created that load in the first place. But we did it in practice. We went through, we saw a flow, we expanded on it, and we improved. And each stage, we improve one flow at a time. Now, this is useful because there are some very, very good algorithms for doing one flow. In fact, there are ones that are computationally crazy fast. The one I showed here was just one of the simplest ones to explain, the simplest to convince you that yes, this is a maximal flow, but there are some that are very, very well optimized. And our initial condition, because this is a progressive approximation algorithm, we just start with the max flow, so we ignore any interactions because we haven't dealt with them yet. But there's some questions. First of which is, does it always come to an end? Because every time you change one flow, it changes everything else around it. Do you always keep getting better? Can you always find another way to get better, to squeeze a little bit more out, a little bit more out? Does it always end with the right answer? If it goes to completion, is there not some better way of doing it that it missed? This can be a real concern with greedy algorithms like this, that's always trying to do what's locally best. Now, there is a technique called linear programming that works with sets of linear equations and inequalities. But there are some caveats, such as they can be pretty slow. Some of the algorithms can be very fast, but their worst cases can be very, very slow. And there's a lot of things where it doesn't get to take advantage of, like knowing how flows work. So you might have situations where flow conditions are violated in the middle. And if you're in a situation where you need to get at least a pretty good answer, having something that might not be an answer midway could be a huge detriment. If you're, say, routing internet traffic, and you need this much from this person, this much from this person, it's much better to have a pretty good answer right now than a perfect answer much later. Thank you. I don't know how many videos this has turned out to be. It's been a lot of recording time. But you can always ask your questions in the comments, maybe on my Twitter account, though I'd rather you just send me comments. And I don't know if I'll do this again. Maybe if I write another math paper, I'll do something like this. Or maybe I'll do a follow-up on this. Who knows? Anyway, I am not looking forward to editing all of this. Bye.